I had been planning the trip for months, carefully mapping out every detail. My goal was simple: get away from the city for a week, spend some time alone in the wilderness, and reconnect with myself. I found a small cabin deep in the forest, far enough from any town or road that I wouldn't see anyone for days. The pictures online made it look perfect. A single wooden structure, tucked into a clearing surrounded by dense pine and oak trees, with a small creek running nearby. It wasn't fancy, but it had electricity, running water, and even a wood-burning stove. I wanted isolation, but I didn't want to be completely cut off from modern life in case of emergencies. The drive there was long. The closer I got, the narrower and rougher the roads became, eventually turning into gravel and dirt that rattled the suspension of my car. By the time I parked at the edge of the trail leading to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. I grabbed my backpack, which was loaded with food, water, firewood, and basic survival gear, and began walking the trail. The forest was quiet in a way that city life can't prepare you for. There was no traffic, no distant hum of power lines, no neighbors calling out, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Every step felt heavy with anticipation. I could feel the isolation settling around me, thick and palpable. The cabin appeared after about 30 minutes of walking. Its wooden walls were weathered, the roof slightly sagging in the middle, but it looked sturdy enough. The small porch had a couple of old chairs and a stack of firewood neatly piled beside the door. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The smell of old wood mixed with faint dampness filled my nose. It wasn't unpleasant, just very earthy, very real. Dust motes floated in the streaks of sunlight that made their way through the grimy windows. I dropped my backpack and began unpacking, stacking food in the small kitchen, setting up my sleeping bag in the main room, and checking the stove and water supply. Everything seemed functional. I lit a small fire, enjoying the crackle and warmth, and watched the smoke curl up the chimney. Night fell quickly, and with it came an unfamiliar darkness. The forest outside seemed to close in, the shadows of the trees stretching across the clearing like giant hands. I went to bed early, hoping the unfamiliar sounds wouldn't disturb me. But that night I barely slept. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls and rattling the windows. Every gust made the entire structure creak and groan as if it were alive. There were noises I couldn't identify, the skittering of small animals, the heavy rustle of something larger moving through the trees. My imagination tried to fill in the blanks, but I forced myself to focus on the rational explanations. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. Still, my heart thumped harder than usual every time a louder noise came from the darkness outside. The next morning, I woke early, grateful for the daylight. I ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, then decided to explore the surroundings. The creek I had seen from the porch ran clear and cold, winding between mossy rocks and fallen trees. I followed it for a while, admiring the way the sunlight danced on the water. It felt peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that can soothe your mind after weeks of city noise. But the further I went, the more I became aware of just how alone I really was. There were no sounds of other humans, no roads, no distant hums, just the forest. It was freeing, but it also made me aware that any mistake out here could have real consequences. If I twisted an ankle, fell, or got lost, there wouldn't be anyone for miles to help me. That thought was uncomfortable, but I pushed it aside and continued exploring. By mid-afternoon, I returned to the cabin and began stacking more firewood for the night. That's when I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They were human and they didn't look old, maybe a few hours at most. My stomach tightened. I was alone here. No one else should be here. The trail I had walked was long and difficult, not an easy path for a casual hiker. My mind raced through possibilities. Could someone be watching me? Was it a hunter or another traveler who had stumbled upon the cabin? I had no idea, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I didn't see anyone, and I checked around the cabin, even the surrounding woods. There was no one there. The footprints led away from the cabin into the dense forest, disappearing among the trees. I decided to not go after them. My gut told me to stay put, The rest of the day passed uneasily. Every sound outside seemed amplified. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, the distant caw of a crow. It all set my nerves on edge. I kept the door locked, double-checked the windows, and made sure the fire was burning. I stayed inside, pacing occasionally, preparing a bigger fire just in case. By nightfall, the darkness outside seemed heavier than before, almost oppressive. I had trouble sleeping again, lying awake and listening to noises that seemed to move closer and further away in random patterns. Something about the forest at night was unpredictable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The following morning, I woke to an unusual quiet. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed almost motionless. I forced myself to eat breakfast and consider my options. I could leave immediately and drive back to civilization, but I had committed to this trip. I wanted the solitude, and I didn't want fear to dictate my decisions. I spent the morning walking along the creek again, paying attention to any signs of human presence. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. An abandoned campsite, only a few hundred meters from the cabin. A fire pit with cold ashes, a few discarded cans, and a torn tent flap flapping in the wind. Whoever had been here had left recently, but I didn't see any footprints leading back toward the cabin. It felt like they had been moving in the forest, unseen, watching perhaps, and then vanished. My hands shook slightly as I made my way back to the cabin. Over the next couple of days, I tried to stick to routines to calm myself. I collected water from the creek, chopped firewood, explored nearby trails, and made sure I had enough food. Each day, however, I kept noticing small signs of someone else's presence. Footprints near the cabin, marks on trees that weren't there before, the faint smell of smoke from a fire that wasn't mine. I began to notice other details, too. Sometimes I would see glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line, and once I thought I heard voices far away, though I couldn't be sure. It wasn't constant, but enough to make me uneasy. I considered leaving several times, but would convince myself that it could all be wildlife or wind-carrying sounds. Still, I felt my anxiety build each night as darkness fell. On the fourth night, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting by the fire in the main room, trying to read a book to distract myself, when I heard a very distinct sound outside, the crunching of leaves under heavy boots. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped for a moment, then continued, coming closer to the cabin. I quietly slid the door closed and locked it, my mind racing. I had nothing to defend myself with except a small hatchet I kept by the stove for chopping kindling. The sound circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to intimidate me. My breathing became shallow, my hands clammy. I sat perfectly still, willing myself not to make any noise, praying they wouldn't see me through the windows. It went on for what felt like an hour. Every time the sounds paused, I held my breath, thinking they had gone. But then I would hear them start again, moving around the other side of the cabin. My mind ran through every worst-case scenario. An armed intruder, someone desperate or violent, someone who had been watching me since I arrived. Finally, I realized that hiding wasn't enough. I needed to act. I remembered that my car was still parked at the start of the trail, roughly a 30-minute walk through the forest. I had a small flashlight, a backpack with essentials, and the hatchet. I made a decision. I would leave now, quietly, before whoever was outside decided to try the door. I waited for a moment when the footsteps seemed farthest away. Then I opened the door slowly. The cold night air hit me, and I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, keeping low to the ground. I kept the flashlight dim, pointing it toward the ground to avoid drawing attention. The forest seemed alive around me, every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves echoing in my ears. I kept moving, glancing over my shoulder frequently. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the trail and saw my car in the faint moonlight. I sprinted the last 100 meters, fumbling with my keys, and finally got inside. I locked the doors immediately, sat for a moment trying to calm my shaking hands, and then started the engine. As I drove away down the gravel path, I kept scanning the trees, feeling as though eyes were still following me. but there was no one. The drive back to the main road felt like a blur. Every turn, every shadow along the roadside made my heart race. When I finally reached the highway and saw the first streetlights of civilization, a sense of relief washed over me that was almost physical, like a weight lifting off my chest. I pulled over briefly to catch my breath, looking back toward the forest, realizing that I had survived something terrifying simply by staying alert, keeping my wits, and acting decisively. The isolation I had sought had turned into something else entirely, a test of survival and courage I hadn't anticipated. Once home, I unpacked slowly, making sure nothing from the trip remained that could draw attention back to me. I slept deeply that night, unbothered by the usual city noises that had once seemed annoying. In the following days, I reflected on the trip, realizing that I had learned a lot about myself, how I reacted under pressure, how cautious and aware I could be, and the importance of trusting my instincts. The fear I felt in the cabin had been real and raw, but it had also sharpened my senses in a way that no city life could. I knew I would never go to such a remote cabin again alone, not without a plan for every possible scenario, but I also knew I had faced a very real threat and come out safely. That clarity, that feeling of having survived something dangerous on my own terms, stayed with me long after the forest disappeared behind me. I had been planning the trip for months, trying to find a quiet place far away from anyone else. The city had been suffocating me with its noise and light, the constant movement of people and cars, and I wanted something raw, something unfiltered. I wanted to disappear into the wilderness, at least for a few days. I had found a small, remote area deep in the mountains, a place that didn't appear on most maps. I packed everything carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, some dry food, a first aid kit, and a lot of water. I carried a backpack that felt heavier than it should have, but it was necessary. I wanted to be prepared for anything. The drive to the trailhead had been long, winding through narrow mountain roads that I barely recognized on the GPS. The air changed as I climbed higher, thinner, cooler, cleaner, and with it, my sense of anticipation grew. I parked the car near a small dirt path that led into the forest and began hiking. The first hour was easy. The trail was clear, and the sun was still high, casting dappled shadows through the tall pines. The smell of pine needles and wet earth filled the air, a scent I always associated with freedom. I felt alive in a way I never did in the city. By mid-afternoon, the trail became less distinct. I had to step over fallen logs and navigate around thick brush. I noticed animal tracks, deer and smaller creatures. Occasionally, I heard the rustle of something moving in the underbrush, but I told myself it was just squirrels or birds. My heart beat a little faster than usual, but that was expected when alone in the woods. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that I was experienced, that I had done this before. Still, the sense of isolation began to sink in. After several hours, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for a campsite. It was near a stream, which would give me water if needed, and sheltered by tall trees that blocked the wind. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the ground was level and there were no rocks that would make sleeping uncomfortable. I unpacked my stove and started boiling water for dinner. I had brought a simple meal, rice and canned beans. As I ate, I noticed the shadows growing longer. The sun dipped below the mountain ridges, and the forest became quieter, as if it were holding its breath. Night fell quickly. The forest was alive with small sounds: an owl hooting somewhere in the distance, the crackle of leaves under the steps of unseen animals, the gurgle of the stream. I felt a thrill of excitement and unease. Being alone in a place like this changed the way I noticed everything. Every sound, every movement mattered. After cleaning up my cooking area and securing my supplies, I crawled into the sleeping bag and tried to rest. Sleep was slow to come. The forest felt enormous, pressing in from all sides. At times, I thought I saw shapes moving outside the tent, but when I focused, they were just shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the wilderness was aware of me in a way I wasn't used to. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a heavy branch snapping. My heart jumped into my throat. I lay still, straining to hear anything else. There was nothing, just the forest breathing, the stream flowing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear passing by. I had a small camping knife at my side, and the bear spray was within reach, but I tried not to think about it too much. I forced myself to lie back and eventually drifted into a light, restless sleep. I woke again a few hours later to the sound of something scraping against the tent. My eyes shot open. It wasn't just a branch this time. The sound was deliberate, slow, methodical. Someone or something was moving outside. My stomach dropped. I had thought this trip would be peaceful, a chance to escape the stress of daily life. But suddenly I felt completely vulnerable. The forest that had seemed so beautiful in daylight was now a maze of shapes and unknowns. I gripped my knife, ready for anything, and waited. The scraping continued for a few minutes and then stopped. I held my breath, listening, but no further sounds came. The minutes dragged on, each one an eternity. I debated whether to leave the tent and confront whatever it was or stay hidden and quiet. I chose to stay. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I peeked outside the tent. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of movement other than the usual wildlife. I felt both relieved and foolish. Maybe it had been a deer. Maybe it had been the wind. But deep down, I knew the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me for the rest of the day. I decided to pack up and move closer to the stream. It wasn't far, and there was a flatter area that would make setting up a new tent easier. I hiked slowly, every sense alert. The forest seemed calmer in the light, but I noticed new things. Broken branches where animals had passed, patches of mud indicating recent rain, and a distant sound that might have been another person moving through the underbrush. I tried not to panic. I kept reminding myself I was alone, and most of the time people weren't out here this far. Still, my pulse never fully returned to normal. The day was spent quietly. I collected firewood, filtered water from the stream, and made sure my new campsite was secure. I built a small fire pit and cleared the surrounding area of debris. I didn't see anyone else, but the feeling of unease remained. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to explore a little further along the stream. I wanted to stretch my legs, to see more of the terrain, to feel like I was getting the most out of the trip. The forest opened into a small meadow, the grass wet with morning dew, the sun shining through patches of mist. It was beautiful. For a moment, I almost forgot the fear from the night before. Almost. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate, heavy, breaking twigs in a way that didn't belong to the usual wildlife. I froze. My mind raced. There wasn't anyone around. The trail I had come from was empty. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving cautiously, aware of my presence. My stomach churned. I considered running back to the campsite, but the noise wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from deeper in the meadow to my side. I had no weapon except the knife and the small amount of bear spray. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that I was trained in situational awareness, that I had stayed composed in tense situations before. I crouched behind a fallen log and watched. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting, as if whoever it was searching for something. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel it. Something large moving through the grass, careful, deliberate. My heart pounded. I considered my options. Retreating to the tent seemed like the safest choice. I moved slowly, keeping low, making sure I didn't step on twigs. Every movement felt loud, exaggerated, dangerous. When I reached the campsite, I grabbed my pack and stove, shoving them into the tent in case I had to move quickly. The footsteps were closer now. I could hear breathing that wasn't my own. The person or animal was near, maybe 30 feet away. I debated calling for help, but there was no cell service here. The only option was to move. I grabbed my knife and bear spray, took a deep breath, and started walking slowly toward the stream, then along it, hoping to find a more concealed path. The rest of the day was a tense blur. Every sound made me flinch. Birds took off suddenly, squirrels scattered, and the wind shifted in a way that made me certain I was being followed. I never saw anyone, but I knew the forest could hide things very well. By evening, I found a smaller clearing, more concealed, near a cluster of large boulders. I set up the tent quickly, using the boulders as natural barriers. I buried my food under some leaves, away from the tent, and made sure the entrance was facing the rocks so I could watch any approach. Night fell again. I barely slept, keeping one ear open for the slightest sound. I didn't hear anyone, but I also didn't feel completely safe. I stayed alert, awake most of the night, listening to the forest and waiting. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a light, fitful sleep. When I woke the next morning, the campsite was undisturbed. No footprints except my own, no broken branches, nothing. I packed everything carefully, sticking to the plan to leave the area and head back toward the main trail. I stayed close to the stream, using it as a guide. I moved slowly but steadily, alert, checking behind me every few minutes. After hours of careful hiking, I finally reached the trailhead, the distant hum of cars reassuring in its normalcy. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The forest that had terrified me now felt safe again, the danger left behind with each step closer to civilization. I drove home, exhausted, tense, but grateful. The experience had been harrowing, terrifying at moments, but I had survived. I had made careful decisions, stayed alert, and trusted my instincts. I learned to respect the wilderness, not as a mystical or supernatural place, but as a living environment where danger could take many forms, from animals, terrain, or even other humans. I returned home and spent hours unpacking and cleaning my gear. I thought about what had happened, replaying each moment in my mind. The fear had been real, the tension unavoidable, but so had my ability to endure, to make choices, and to stay alive. I realized that preparedness and vigilance were not just abstract concepts. They were the difference between safety and disaster. From that trip onward, I never underestimated the wilderness. I learned to appreciate every sound, every shadow, every rustle in the leaves. I never stopped feeling the thrill of being alone in nature, but I also never forgot the fear, the knowledge that danger can exist quietly, subtly, and without warning. And that day, I learned that surviving the wilderness meant respecting it completely, staying aware, and never letting complacency take hold. I had always loved camping alone. There was something about leaving the city behind, trading the constant hum of traffic for the quiet, untamed sounds of the forest, that drew me in. It was freedom, pure and unfiltered, and I felt alive in a way that I never could in my usual life. This particular trip was supposed to be no different. I had chosen a remote section of forest along a narrow stretch of a river in a mountainous region I had scouted on a map weeks earlier. It was far enough from the nearest road that I would likely not see another human for several days, which was exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning, driving until the paved roads ended and giving way to a dirt path that jostled my car with every inch. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made my lungs feel like they were burning with every inhale. I parked at a clearing that seemed like it might have once been used as a campsite before nature had begun reclaiming it, and I unloaded my gear with methodical care. My pack was heavy, filled with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, first aid, and extra clothes. I moved cautiously, aware of how quickly the terrain could change if I stepped the wrong way on loose rocks or hidden roots. The forest was dense, tall conifers standing close together with their lower branches thick and rough. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles, moss, and a network of roots that seemed to twist and wriggle underfoot. The smell was pungent: wet earth, pine sap, decaying leaves. But it was a clean, natural scent, grounding me to the world I had come to escape into. Birds called occasionally, their sounds distant, echoing between the trees, but the forest was otherwise silent. I set up my tent in a small clearing by the riverbank. The river itself was narrow but fast-flowing, water tumbling over rocks and logs, producing a constant, soothing roar. I collected firewood in bundles, careful to break small branches from deadfall instead of living trees. I stacked them in a neat pile, envisioning the warmth they would provide once night fell. My movements were deliberate, each action precise, almost ritualistic. I had camped before, but there was a different rhythm when you were alone. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could become serious. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows between the trees. I lit a small fire near the tent, watching the flames leap and curl, sending sparks into the dimming air. I cooked a simple meal, dehydrated vegetables and rice, warmed over the flames. It was not luxurious, but it was nourishing, and the effort of cooking outdoors was part of the satisfaction. The first night came fast. Darkness swallowed the forest gradually, and I felt the chill creep into my bones. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the river blending with the occasional snap of a branch somewhere nearby. Sleep was slow to come, my mind alert to every noise, every movement. I had prepared for wildlife encounters, but even so, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch, made my pulse quicken. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep. It was a sudden, harsh sound that woke me. At first, I thought it was a branch breaking in the wind, but the sound repeated. A distinct, deliberate snap of wood from somewhere near the riverbank. My eyes snapped open, scanning the darkness outside the tent. The fire had burned low, leaving me with only the faint glow of embers to light the clearing. I froze, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. There was a wet, dragging sound now, like something heavy moving over the leaf-strewn ground. I sat up, trying to see through the tent walls. Moonlight filtered faintly through the canopy, revealing nothing but the rough outlines of trees and the glint of water. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and forced my body to calm down. I knew better than to panic, but the sound was different from anything I had encountered before. It was deliberate, careful, and it seemed to be moving closer. I reached for my flashlight, keeping it low so as not to give away my presence. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty, but the riverbank was visible now, and there, on the edge of the trees, I saw the shape of a large animal, or maybe more than one. It was hard to tell in the low light, but the movement was smooth, controlled, and it stopped just at the edge of the shadows, staring. My stomach dropped. I had seen bears before in documentaries, on hiking trails, in wildlife programs, but this was real. My mind raced through everything I had learned about wildlife safety. Bears usually avoid humans if they can, but this one, or perhaps two, was not moving like it was afraid. It was watching, almost studying, waiting. I knew staying calm was essential, but my body felt frozen. I backed slowly into the tent, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows. My fire was almost out, and I knew I needed light and noise to deter a potential attack. I grabbed my emergency whistle and blew it sharply, a piercing shriek that echoed through the trees. There was a rustle, a startled retreat, but then silence. I held my breath, listening, every nerve tense. Minutes passed. Then, carefully, I unzipped the tent again and peeked. The shadows were gone. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, watching the darkness and listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, the forest looked innocent and peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. I ate breakfast mechanically, packed my gear, and considered leaving immediately. But I was stubborn. I wanted to stick to my plan. I decided to hike further into the forest, away from the riverbank where the encounter had occurred. The next day, I explored the surrounding area, making mental notes of landmarks, water sources, and potential hazards. I followed animal tracks for a while, watching their patterns, always alert for anything unusual. The forest was alive with movement, but nothing as unnerving as the previous night. By mid-afternoon, I had found a small clearing on higher ground, a spot that felt safe and isolated, with a good view of the surrounding area. I set up my tent again, determined to keep the fire small and controlled, but I still collected extra wood in case I needed it for defense. Night 2 was quieter, though I remained vigilant. The sounds of the forest were familiar now. An owl hooting in the distance, the river murmuring far below, the occasional rustle of small animals. But I felt on edge, my mind constantly scanning for anything unusual. Around midnight, I heard it. A low, guttural growl from the trees. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still, trying to locate the source. It was close, much closer than the sounds of normal wildlife. I grabbed a stick, heavy enough to swing, and slowly unzipped the tent flap. Nothing. The growl repeated once, then stopped. I realized the animal, or whatever it was, had been circling my campsite. Fear gave way to a cold determination. I needed to stay alert to protect myself without panicking. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire burning brightly, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound, ready for any movement. The night stretched on endlessly, each hour a test of patience and endurance. Morning finally arrived, bringing light and a false sense of relief. I had survived the night, but I knew I couldn't remain complacent. I packed up and began a careful hike along a ridge trail, moving away from the river and deeper into the forest. I kept my senses sharp, scanning for tracks, listening for snapping twigs, and noting areas where the ground had been disturbed. Hours passed. I ate minimally, conserving energy and staying hydrated. As I neared the third day of my trip, I stumbled upon evidence of other large animals. Bear tracks, deep claw marks on trees, signs that someone or something had been in the area recently. I realized I was in prime territory for wildlife that was used to hunting, foraging, and possibly defending its territory. I slowed my pace, careful not to make sudden movements or loud noises. Every step required focus. Late that afternoon, I found a small rock outcropping that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. It was safe, elevated, and visible from a distance. I decided to set up camp there. I cleared the area of loose branches and debris, built a small fire ring, and secured my gear in a way that nothing could roll down the slope or be easily reached by curious animals. The view was breathtaking, the forest stretching endlessly below, rivers and streams winding like silver ribbons. I felt a tentative sense of accomplishment. I had navigated the forest, faced its dangers, and maintained control over my situation. That night, I slept with my fire well stocked, flashlight by my side, and a makeshift noisemaker crafted from rocks in case of an intrusion. The hours passed slowly, but nothing approached. The forest remained quiet in a way that was both comforting and eerie. I drifted in and out of sleep, hyper-aware but no longer panicked, learning to coexist with the sounds and rhythms of the wilderness. By the fourth morning, I felt a surge of confidence. I had endured unpredictable wildlife encounters, navigated difficult terrain, and managed my resources carefully. I decided to make the journey back to my car, retracing my path with careful attention to the landmarks I had memorized. The hike was long, each step deliberate, but I moved with purpose. By late afternoon, the familiar dirt path appeared, the one that led back to civilization. Relief washed over me as I saw my car, untouched and waiting. I loaded my gear with efficiency, feeling the weight of the trip's tension lift off my shoulders. As I drove away, the forest stretched behind me, wild and untamed, full of hidden dangers but also beauty and raw power. I realized that camping alone was not just about solitude. It was about preparation, awareness, and respect for the environment and the creatures that inhabited it. I had been scared, truly, but I had survived. And in that survival, I found a clarity and confidence that I carried back into the world outside the trees. I returned home tired, sore, and deeply changed. I cleaned my gear, reviewed the maps and notes I had taken, and reflected on the experience. I realized that the fear I had felt was not from fantasy or myth, but from reality. The reality of being alone in the wilderness, exposed and vulnerable, yet capable of navigating danger through vigilance and careful action. The forest had tested me and I had passed. I knew I would return someday, but I also knew the limits of my preparation and the unpredictability of nature. And that knowledge, hard-earned, was a kind of victory in itself. I slept that night deeply, finally able to release the tension I had carried for days. My dreams untroubled, my mind clear. I felt a renewed respect for the wilderness and a quiet pride in my ability to endure and navigate its challenges. The fear had been real, intense, and immediate, but it had not defeated me. And that, I realized, was what made the entire experience worthwhile. The next day, I explored the surrounding area, making mental notes of landmarks, water sources, and potential hazards. I followed animal tracks for a while, watching their patterns, always alert for anything unusual. The forest was alive with movement, but nothing as unnerving as the previous night. By mid-afternoon, I had found a small clearing on higher ground, a spot that felt safe and isolated, with a good view of the surrounding area. I set up my tent again, determined to keep the fire small and controlled, but I still collected extra wood in case I needed it for defense. Night 2 was quieter, though I remained vigilant. The sounds of the forest were familiar now. An owl hooting in the distance, the river murmuring far below, the occasional rustle of small animals. But I felt on edge, my mind constantly scanning for anything unusual. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, guttural growl from the trees. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still, trying to locate the source. It was close, much closer than the sounds of normal wildlife. I grabbed a stick, heavy enough to swing, and slowly unzipped the tent flap. Nothing. The growl repeated once, then stopped. I realized the animal, or whatever it was, had been circling my campsite. Fear gave way to a cold determination. I needed to stay alert, to protect myself without panicking. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire burning brightly, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound, ready for any movement. The night stretched on endlessly, each hour a test of patience and endurance. Morning finally arrived, bringing light and a false sense of relief. I had survived the night, but I knew I couldn't remain complacent. I packed up and began a careful hike along a ridge trail, moving away from the river and deeper into the forest. I kept my senses sharp, scanning for tracks, listening for snapping twigs, and noting areas where the ground had been disturbed. Hours passed. I ate minimally, conserving energy and staying hydrated. As I neared the third day of my trip, I stumbled upon evidence of other large animals. Bear tracks, deep claw marks on trees, signs that someone or something had been in the area recently. I realized I was in prime territory for wildlife that was used to hunting, foraging, and possibly defending its territory. I slowed my pace, careful not to make sudden movements or loud noises. Every step required focus. Late that afternoon, I found a small rock outcropping that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. It was safe, elevated, and visible from a distance. I decided to set up camp there. I cleared the area of loose branches and debris, built a small fire ring, and secured my gear in a way that nothing could roll down the slope or be easily reached by curious animals. The view was breathtaking, the forest stretching endlessly below, rivers and streams winding like silver ribbons. I felt a tentative sense of accomplishment. I had navigated the forest, faced its dangers, and maintained control over my situation. That night, I slept with my fire well-stocked, flashlight by my side, and a makeshift noisemaker crafted from rocks in case of an intrusion. The hours passed slowly, but nothing approached. The forest remained quiet in a way that was both comforting and eerie. I drifted in and out of sleep, hyper-aware but no longer panicked, learning to coexist with the sounds and rhythms of the wilderness. By the fourth morning, I felt a surge of confidence. I had endured unpredictable wildlife encounters, navigated difficult terrain, and managed my resources carefully. I decided to make the journey back to my car, retracing my path with careful attention to the landmarks I had memorized. The hike was long, each step deliberate, but I moved with purpose. By late afternoon, the familiar dirt path appeared, the one that led back to civilization. Relief washed over me as I saw my car, untouched and waiting. I loaded my gear with efficiency, feeling the weight of the trip's tension lift off my shoulders. As I drove away, the forest stretched behind me, wild and untamed, full of hidden dangers but also beauty and raw power. I realized that camping alone was not just about solitude. It was about preparation, awareness, and respect for the environment and the creatures that inhabited it. I had been scared, truly, but I had survived. And in that survival, I found a clarity and confidence that I carried back into the world outside the trees. I returned home tired, sore, and deeply changed. I cleaned my gear, reviewed the maps and notes I had taken, and reflected on the experience. I realized that the fear I had felt was not from fantasy or myth, but from reality, the reality of being alone in the wilderness, exposed and vulnerable, yet capable of navigating danger through vigilance and careful action. The forest had tested me, and I had passed. I knew I would return someday, but I also knew the limits of my preparation and the unpredictability of nature. And that knowledge, hard-earned, was a kind of victory in itself. I slept that night deeply, finally able to release the tension I had carried for days, my dreams untroubled, my mind clear. I felt a renewed respect for the wilderness and a quiet pride in my ability to endure and navigate its challenges. The fear had been real, intense, and immediate, but it had not defeated me. And that, I realized, was what made the entire experience worthwhile. I had always loved camping alone. There was something about leaving the city behind, trading the constant hum of traffic for the quiet, untamed sounds of the forest, that drew me in. It was freedom, pure and unfiltered, and I felt alive in a way that I never could in my usual life. This particular trip was supposed to be no different. I had chosen a remote section of forest along a narrow stretch of a river in a mountainous region I had scouted on a map weeks earlier. It was far enough from the nearest road that I would likely not see another human for several days, which was exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning, driving until the paved roads ended and giving way to a dirt path that jostled my car with every inch. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made my lungs feel like they were burning with every inhale. I parked at a clearing that seemed like it might have once been used as a campsite before nature had begun reclaiming it, and I unloaded my gear with methodical care. My pack was heavy, filled with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, first aid, and extra clothes. I moved cautiously, aware of how quickly the terrain could change if I stepped the wrong way on loose rocks or hidden roots. The forest was dense, tall conifers standing close together with their lower branches thick and rough. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles, moss, and a network of roots that seemed to twist and wriggle underfoot. The smell was pungent: wet earth, pine sap, decaying leaves. But it was a clean, natural scent, grounding me to the world I had come to escape into. Birds called occasionally, their sounds distant, echoing between the trees, but the forest was otherwise silent. I set up my tent in a small clearing by the riverbank. The river itself was narrow but fast-flowing, water tumbling over rocks and logs, producing a constant, soothing roar. I collected firewood in bundles, careful to break small branches from deadfall instead of living trees. I stacked them in a neat pile, envisioning the warmth they would provide once night fell. My movements were deliberate, each action precise, almost ritualistic. I had camped before, but there was a different rhythm when you were alone. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could become serious. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows between the trees. I lit a small fire near the tent, watching the flames leap and curl, sending sparks into the dimming air. I cooked a simple meal: dehydrated vegetables and rice, warmed over the flames. It was not luxurious, but it was nourishing, and the effort of cooking outdoors was part of the satisfaction. The first night came fast. Darkness swallowed the forest gradually, and I felt the chill creep into my bones. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the river blending with the occasional snap of a branch somewhere nearby. Sleep was slow to come, my mind alert to every noise, every movement. I had prepared for wildlife encounters, but even so, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch, made my pulse quicken. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep. It was a sudden, harsh sound that woke me. At first, I thought it was a branch breaking in the wind, but the sound repeated. A distinct, deliberate snap of wood from somewhere near the riverbank. My eyes snapped open, scanning the darkness outside the tent. The fire had burned low, leaving me with only the faint glow of embers to light the clearing. I froze, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. There was a wet, dragging sound now, like something heavy moving over the leaf-strewn ground. I sat up, trying to see through the tent walls. Moonlight filtered faintly through the canopy, revealing nothing but the rough outlines of trees and the glint of water. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and forced my body to calm down. I knew better than to panic. But the sound was different from anything I had encountered before. It was deliberate, careful, and it seemed to be moving closer. I reached for my flashlight, keeping it low so as not to give away my presence. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty, but the riverbank was visible now, and there, on the edge of the trees, I saw the shape of a large animal, or maybe more than one. It was hard to tell in the low light, but the movement was smooth, controlled, and it stopped just at the edge of the shadows, staring. My stomach dropped. I had seen bears before in documentaries, on hiking trails, in wildlife programs, but this was real. My mind raced through everything I had learned about wildlife safety. Bears usually avoid humans if they can, but this one, or perhaps two, was not moving like it was afraid. It was watching, almost studying, waiting. I knew staying calm was essential, but my body felt frozen. I backed slowly into the tent, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows. My fire was almost out, and I knew I needed light and noise to deter a potential attack. I grabbed my emergency whistle and blew it sharply, a piercing shriek that echoed through the trees. There was a rustle, a startled retreat, but then silence. I held my breath, listening, every nerve tense. Minutes passed. Then, carefully, I unzipped the tent again and peeked. The shadows were gone. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, watching the darkness and listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, the forest looked innocent and peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. I ate breakfast mechanically, packed my gear, and considered leaving immediately. But I was stubborn. I wanted to stick to my plan. I decided to hike further into the forest, away from the riverbank where the encounter had occurred. I had always loved camping alone. There was something about leaving the city behind, trading the constant hum of traffic for the quiet, untamed sounds of the forest, that drew me in. It was freedom, pure and unfiltered, and I felt alive in a way that I never could in my usual life. This particular trip was supposed to be no different. I had chosen a remote section of forest along a narrow stretch of a river in a mountainous region I had scouted on a map weeks earlier. It was far enough from the nearest road that I would likely not see another human for several days, which was exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning, driving until the paved roads ended and giving way to a dirt path that jostled my car with every inch. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made my lungs feel like they were burning with every inhale. I parked at a clearing that seemed like it might have once been used as a campsite before nature had begun reclaiming it, and I unloaded my gear with methodical care. My pack was heavy, filled with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, first aid, and extra clothes. I moved cautiously, aware of how quickly the terrain could change if I stepped the wrong way on loose rocks or hidden roots. The forest was dense, tall conifers standing close together with their lower branches thick and rough. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles, moss, and a network of roots that seemed to twist and wriggle underfoot. The smell was pungent: wet earth, pine sap, decaying leaves. But it was a clean, natural scent, grounding me to the world I had come to escape into. Birds called occasionally, their sounds distant, echoing between the trees, but the forest was otherwise silent. I set up my tent in a small clearing by the riverbank. The river itself was narrow but fast-flowing, water tumbling over rocks and logs, producing a constant, soothing roar. I collected firewood in bundles, careful to break small branches from deadfall instead of living trees. I stacked them in a neat pile, envisioning the warmth they would provide once night fell. My movements were deliberate, each action precise, almost ritualistic. I had camped before, but there was a different rhythm when you were alone. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could become serious. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows between the trees. I lit a small fire near the tent, watching the flames leap and curl, sending sparks into the dimming air. I cooked a simple meal, dehydrated vegetables and rice, warmed over the flames. It was not luxurious, but it was nourishing, and the effort of cooking outdoors was part of the satisfaction. The first night came fast. Darkness swallowed the forest gradually, and I felt the chill creep into my bones. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the river blending with the occasional snap of a branch somewhere nearby. Sleep was slow to come, my mind alert to every noise, every movement. I had prepared for wildlife encounters, but even so, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch, made my pulse quicken. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep. It was a sudden, harsh sound that woke me. At first, I thought it was a branch breaking in the wind, but the sound repeated. A distinct, deliberate snap of wood from somewhere near the riverbank. My eyes snapped open, scanning the darkness outside the tent. The fire had burned low, leaving me with only the faint glow of embers to light the clearing. I froze, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. There was a wet, dragging sound now, like something heavy moving over the leaf-strewn ground. I sat up, trying to see through the tent walls. Moonlight filtered faintly through the canopy, revealing nothing but the rough outlines of trees and the glint of water. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and forced my body to calm down. I knew better than to panic, but the sound was different from anything I had encountered before. It was deliberate, careful, and it seemed to be moving closer. I reached for my flashlight, keeping it low so as not to give away my presence. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty, but the riverbank was visible now, and there, on the edge of the trees, I saw the shape of a large animal, or maybe more than one. It was hard to tell in the low light, but the movement was smooth, controlled, and it stopped just at the edge of the shadows, staring. My stomach dropped. I had seen bears before in documentaries, on hiking trails, in wildlife programs, but this was real. My mind raced through everything I had learned about wildlife safety. Bears usually avoid humans if they can, but this one, or perhaps two, was not moving like it was afraid. It was watching, almost studying, waiting. I knew staying calm was essential, but my body felt frozen. I backed slowly into the tent, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows. My fire was almost out, and I knew I needed light and noise to deter a potential attack. I grabbed my emergency whistle and blew it sharply, a piercing shriek that echoed through the trees. There was a rustle, a startled retreat, but then silence. I held my breath, listening, every nerve tense. Minutes passed. Then, carefully, I unzipped the tent again and peeked. The shadows were gone. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, watching the darkness and listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, the forest looked innocent and peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. I ate breakfast mechanically, packed my gear, and considered leaving immediately. But I was stubborn. I wanted to stick to my plan. I decided to hike further into the forest, away from the riverbank where the encounter had occurred. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed time away from the constant noise of the city, away from people, from responsibilities, from everything. I wanted to immerse myself completely in nature, to breathe air that wasn't tinged with smoke or exhaust, to hear nothing but wind and birds and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I had chosen a remote spot I'd read about in a hiking forum, far enough from roads that the few visitors it received were sparse and unpredictable. I had no intention of seeing anyone else. I arrived in the late afternoon, my car bouncing over a dirt road that dwindled into nothing but a narrow trail flanked by tall pines and thick undergrowth. The forest smelled like earth and pine sap and wet moss. I parked my car in a small clearing and gathered my gear. A sturdy backpack, tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a first aid kit, and a compact stove. I had made a mental map of the area and knew where the nearest stream was for water, a ridge that would provide a clear view of the valley below, and a patch of soft ground perfect for my tent. The first hours were uneventful, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I hiked along a faint trail, stepping over roots and fallen branches, noticing how the light changed as the sun moved closer to the horizon. Shadows stretched long between the trees, and I could hear the distant cry of a hawk circling above. There was a kind of peaceful isolation in being completely alone, the way my footsteps echoed slightly in the quiet, and the breeze whispered through the leaves in a language only the forest could speak. I chose a small clearing for my camp, surrounded on 3 sides by dense trees and facing the setting sun. The ground was flat and firm, with a thin layer of fallen pine needles and dry leaves. I set up my tent with care, making sure the corners were tight and the stakes secure. I built a small fire pit from stones I found nearby, careful to keep it contained. The smell of burning would mingled with the earthy scent of the forest, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in the simple act of survival. Night fell fast in the forest. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows became deeper, more intricate. The wind carried strange noises, the cracking of branches, the distant thump of something moving through the undergrowth, the occasional call of an animal. At first, it was easy to convince myself it was all normal, the natural soundtrack of a forest at night. I ate a small dinner, boiled water for tea, and then sat near the fire, letting the heat chase away the chill. I was not a particularly paranoid person, but as darkness deepened, I began to feel a subtle sense of unease. It was not fear exactly, but awareness. There was something in the way the trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, the way the wind carried sounds that seemed almost deliberate, like footsteps that slowed when I moved. I tried to shake it off as imagination, the product of isolation and low light, and eventually crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay on my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric overhead, listening to the world beyond. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a noise, a faint rustling, soft and irregular, coming from the edge of the clearing. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon, a deer, maybe even a bear. I froze, trying to detect the pattern. The sound was deliberate, moving closer, and yet, there was no snap of twigs underfoot, no scent that I could catch. My heart rate quickened, but I reminded myself that I had seen tracks along the trail earlier, and the forest was full of life. Still, the sound kept coming, circling the clearing almost, stopping and starting, impossible to predict. I decided to wait, staying perfectly still, listening as the rustling grew louder in some moments and then quieter in others. The minutes stretched and sleep became impossible. I reached for my flashlight, tried to shine it outside the tent, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. All I could see were the black silhouettes of trees and the uneven ground of the clearing. I considered waking in the morning and investigating, but the practical part of me knew better. In the dark, I had no way to defend myself if it was a larger animal, and the last thing I wanted was to provoke whatever it was. The rustling eventually moved away, fading slowly into the night. I lay awake, feeling the chill from the forest seep through my sleeping bag, my senses alert to every tiny sound. I couldn't go back to sleep. By the time the first hint of dawn appeared, I had barely rested at all, and my body ached from tension and cold. The sunrise was pale and slow, brushing the tops of the trees with soft light, revealing dew on every leaf and pine needle. I got out of the tent and walked to the small stream I had located the day before. The water was cold and clear, and as I drank and washed my face, I felt a bit of relief, some of the tension loosening. I decided to spend the day moving around, mapping the nearby ridges and valleys, and perhaps finding a safer, more open area to camp the next night. I packed up my tent, made sure my fire was completely out, and started hiking along the faint trail I had seen. The forest looked completely different in daylight. The trees were lighter in color, the undergrowth dense but navigable, and the sounds of the forest alive with birds, insects, and small animals. Still, every once in a while, I felt eyes on me, a presence I couldn't identify. I reminded myself that I was alone, and it was just the forest adjusting to my movement. By mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. The sight was breathtaking. The patchwork of trees, the silver ribbon of a stream cutting through the green, the mountains rising in the distance. I sat on a rock and drank water, eating a simple snack, feeling a rare sense of calm. It was the kind of moment that made all the tension and exhaustion worthwhile, the kind of scene that reminded me why I came here in the first place. first, it seemed like a good choice. The forest felt wilder, untouched. I found a small clearing with a rock outcrop overlooking a shallow ravine. I paused to take pictures, enjoy the view, and rest. But as the afternoon wore on, the path became harder to follow. The forest grew denser, the light dimmer as the trees thickened. I kept checking the map, trying to reconcile it with what I was seeing, but the landmarks seemed off. By late afternoon, I realized I might have gone too far. The trail markers were gone, and the path had all but disappeared. My heart started to race. I had enough supplies to spend a night out here if needed, but I didn't want to do that. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked similar. Trees, shadows, fallen logs. It all blended together. I slowed my breathing, trying to think rationally. I used my compass to determine direction, estimating the location of the clearing where I had parked my car. I walked for another hour, but the forest seemed endless. The sun was starting to sink again, casting long, dark shadows. I knew that if I didn't find my way soon, I would have to spend the night in unfamiliar terrain. Panic began to creep in, though I tried to push it down. I reminded myself I was prepared. I had a flashlight, matches, a fire starter, and extra food. I could build a temporary shelter if needed. As the light faded, I finally found a small stream. I remembered that my original campsite had a stream nearby, and I hoped following it would lead me back. I walked alongside it, stepping carefully over slippery rocks and fallen branches. The sound of water was comforting, steady, guiding me through the darkness. I checked my watch. Sunset had passed, and soon it would be completely dark. I wished I had brought a headlamp with extra batteries. My phone had very little signal, just enough for emergency use, and I kept it off to save battery. Eventually, I stumbled across a small clearing. It wasn't my original campsite, but it was flat and safe enough to set up a temporary camp. I cleared a space, set up my tent, and gathered firewood from the surrounding area. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I thought about the noises I had heard last night and tonight, reminding myself they were just animals. I managed to get a small fire going, the flames offering light and warmth. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and then settled down in my sleeping bag. The night was long. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. But I stayed calm, telling myself that panicking would not help. I reviewed what I would do in the morning. Follow the stream, use the compass, and hope it led me back to the road. I slept in short bursts, waking whenever a noise startled me. Morning finally came, gray and damp, with mist rising off the stream. I packed up camp, extinguished the fire completely, and started walking along the stream again. Hours passed, and my legs ached, but finally, I spotted tire tracks in the mud. My pulse quickened. Following them, I eventually came to a small dirt road. Relief flooded me. I was not lost anymore. I followed the road a short distance and saw my car parked exactly where I had left it, the early morning sunlight glinting off the windshield. I checked myself for injuries, scratches, bruises, nothing serious. I had survived the night and the disorientation of being lost in the forest. I drove back slowly, reflecting on the experience. I realized that while it had been terrifying, it had also taught me a lot about preparation, patience, and the importance of staying calm in the face of fear. I had relied on my gear, my knowledge, and my own determination to make it through safely. When I finally got home, I unpacked my equipment and took a long shower, letting the warm water wash away the stiffness and grime. The memory of the forest, the long night, and the fear I had felt lingered, but it was no longer overwhelming. I knew that if I ever went camping alone again, I would be even better prepared. The forest had been unforgiving, but it had also reminded me of my own resilience. I never forgot the sound of the forest at night, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly. But I also never forgot the relief of the first glimpse of my car, the warmth of a fire, and the feeling of safe, solid ground under my feet. That camping trip had been one of the scariest experiences of my life, but it ended well because I stayed focused, prepared, and careful. It was a reminder that fear is natural, but preparation and calm thinking can carry you through even the most difficult situations. I had been planning the trip for months, mapping out a remote section of the forest that few people visited. The idea was simple: leave the city behind, disappear into the woods for 3 nights, and just be alone with nature. I told no one where exactly I was going, because I wanted it to be entirely my own experience. I packed carefully: enough food for 3 days, a small stove, extra water, a tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small folding knife. I even brought a map and compass, though I was confident in my navigation skills. The forest I was heading into was dense, hilly, and far from any road. It promised isolation, which at the time sounded like freedom. The hike in was harder than I expected. The path became a series of steep inclines and narrow clearings, the kind that twisted and disappeared beneath thick undergrowth. By late afternoon, I had covered nearly 10 miles and reached a small clearing beside a stream. The ground was soft, damp from morning dew, and surrounded by tall pines and oaks. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent quickly, anchoring it tightly against the wind, and then went to collect some firewood. The forest smelled sharp and earthy, the scent of wet leaves and moss heavy in the air. I felt calm and alert at the same time, the kind of alertness that comes when you are entirely responsible for yourself in a wild place. Night fell faster than I expected. I had been sitting by the fire, eating some canned beans and thinking about the city life I had temporarily left behind. Then I started to hear noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the branches. Then I realized the rustling was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Something or someone was moving through the forest near my camp. My heart rate quickened. I stayed still, pretending to focus on the fire, hoping whatever it was would pass. But the sound grew closer, slow, careful steps breaking the silence of the forest floor. My hands shook slightly as I reached for my knife, resting it on my lap where I could grab it easily. The steps stopped for a moment, not far from my tent. I held my breath. The hairs on my neck stood up. I could hear faint breathing. My mind ran through possibilities. A lost hiker, an animal, someone else entirely. The last one terrified me. I had told no one where I was going, but there was always a chance someone could have followed me or stumbled upon me. The thought of being completely alone with someone capable of violence made my stomach churn. I decided to stay in the tent, lying flat against the sleeping pad and pulling the rain flap tightly closed. The shadows outside shifted constantly. I could see glimpses of movement through the thin fabric of the tent, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I didn't dare look directly outside. Hours seemed to pass in silence, punctuated by occasional distant animal cries and the sound of wind through the trees. I tried to remind myself that the most likely explanation was an animal or a hiker who would eventually leave. Still, I could not sleep. Around 3 in the morning, the noise returned, this time closer than before. I could hear deliberate movements around the tent. Something nudged a branch, causing it to scrape against the tent wall. I could feel the vibrations through the fabric. My heart pounded in my chest, loud and insistent. I debated my options. I could leave, but stepping outside in the dark without knowing what was there seemed riskier. I could stay, but then I was trapped, entirely dependent on luck. My mind raced. I remembered the small flashlight in my backpack. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to reach in and grab it. I clicked it on, holding it low to avoid shining directly outside, then pointed it toward the side of the tent. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then I saw it, a shadow moving along the edge of the clearing between the trees. It was human-shaped, crouched slightly, careful. Whoever or whatever it was, they had been watching me. Hours passed, or it felt like hours. The forest remained alive with subtle noises, but the figure never appeared in the light again. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that people rarely stalk hikers this far into the woods. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a light sleep, sitting upright in my chair, flashlight still clutched in my hands. I woke just before dawn to a sudden, piercing sound. Something had crashed into my fire, scattering the ashes and leaving a faint trail of smoke spiraling into the sky. My flashlight was on the ground, and I could hear fast movement, rustling branches, heavy footsteps. I scrambled out of the chair, heart hammering, and grabbed my backpack. Without thinking, I started running toward the trail, leaving the tent and fire behind. My shoes slipped on loose soil, and I stumbled more than once, but adrenaline kept me moving. The forest seemed endless, the trail twisting and turning, indistinguishable in the dim morning light. I didn't stop. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. I didn't dare look back. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I heard the faint noise of running water ahead. I followed it, knowing from the map that it would lead to the ranger station and the main road. My legs ached. My lungs burned, but I forced myself onward. I emerged from the forest onto a dirt road just as the sun rose. My backpack was torn in places, my clothes scratched, and I was covered in dirt and sweat, but I was alive. I flagged down a passing car and explained as best I could what had happened, though I didn't have clear details to give. The driver drove me to the ranger station. They took my statement seriously and immediately sent a patrol to check the area. The investigation revealed something I didn't expect. There were signs that someone had been camping near my site recently. Footprints, makeshift traps, and discarded items that suggested a person had been living in the woods, observing travelers. It seemed clear now that I had stumbled into the territory of someone who was watching and possibly waiting. The ranger told me it wasn't uncommon in remote areas, and that most incidents weren't violent, but the danger was real. I left the forest that day with a mix of relief and lingering fear. I had intended to return eventually, but I never did. The experience stayed with me, shaping the way I approached wilderness trips afterward. I learned to carry more protective gear, always let someone know my exact plans, and to trust the instincts that told me when something felt off. The fear I felt in those hours of darkness was unlike anything I had experienced. It was raw, immediate, and deeply human. And yet, despite it all, I survived, and I carried that survival forward, cautious but wiser. I had been planning this camping trip for months, long before the weather started turning cold. I wanted to escape the city, the noise, the constant hum of people and traffic, and just be alone in the woods for a few days. I had never been on a solo camping trip, but I had been on plenty of short hikes, and I considered myself reasonably prepared. I knew how to start a fire, how to set up a tent, and how to navigate using a map and compass. I packed everything carefully. A small tent, a sleeping bag rated for the cold, a portable stove, dehydrated meals, water, a first aid kit, a headlamp, extra batteries, and a small backpack with survival essentials. I even brought a small multi-tool and a compact hatchet just in case. I drove for hours on winding roads, following the map to a remote area of forest I had found online. The directions were tricky, and at times I worried I had taken a wrong turn, but eventually I arrived at a small clearing just off an unmarked dirt road. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a flat spot between a stand of pines and a small stream. The area smelled fresh, like wet earth and pine needles, and the air was crisp with a hint of the first frost of the season. I parked my car, unloaded my gear, and carried it into the clearing. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven and filled with hidden roots, and I had to clear stones and branches to get a flat enough surface. By the time the tent was up and staked down, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I unpacked my sleeping bag, laid out my small stove, and started boiling water for my dinner. The steam from the kettle mixed with the chill in the air, and I could hear the faint gurgle of the stream nearby. It was quiet, but not completely silent. There were birds settling in for the night, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, and the occasional snap of a twig as some unseen creature moved through the trees. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth from the stove and the solitude. Once the meal was finished, I cleaned up, storing the leftover food in a small container in my car to avoid attracting animals. I was careful. I had read enough survival guides to know that even a single crumb could be enough to draw a curious raccoon or worse. The night began to settle around me, deepening quickly. What had felt peaceful in the afternoon now felt oppressive. The darkness moving closer and swallowing everything beyond the small circle of light from my headlamp. After finishing my preparations, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up, and lay there, listening. The forest at night was alive, not with anything supernatural, but with sounds that my mind could interpret in frightening ways when I was alone. There was a rustling that I could not place, a soft thump as if a branch had fallen somewhere far off. My own breathing seemed loud. I tried to remind myself that this was normal, that animals were out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I eventually forced myself to sleep, though it was fitful. I woke several times in the night to noises outside the tent. The wind had picked up, shaking branches and sending a cold draft into the small vestibule of my tent. I could hear leaves skittering across the ground. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, heavy ones like someone or something was moving slowly but deliberately through the woods. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped after a while, and eventually I fell back asleep. Morning brought relief. Sunlight filtered through the pines, warming the tent slightly. I unzipped the flap, stepped outside, and stretched, letting my eyes adjust to the light. Everything seemed calm, normal. I had breakfast, packed up my stove and utensils, and prepared for a day of exploring. I had a trail marked on my map I wanted to follow, a loop that would take me further into the forest and back. The trail started easily enough, a narrow path worn into the earth, lined with fallen leaves. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the rustle of small animals. I walked for hours, following the map and paying attention to landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. Around midday, I reached a point where the trail split. According to the map, both paths would eventually reconnect, but one path was clearly less traveled. The underbrush was thicker, and I could see evidence of deer and smaller animals, but no recent human footprints. Something about it intrigued me, and I decided to take the less obvious route. I had been so absorbed in the view that I almost didn't notice the figure moving in the distance. At first, it looked like a shadow, perhaps a deer or a large dog. But as I watched, it became clearer. Someone was walking along the far side of the ridge, careful but deliberate, moving closer to my general area. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting anyone. There were no trails on that side of the forest, only thick undergrowth and a series of uneven slopes. Whoever it was must have come from the other side, a long way around, and they were moving purposefully. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. My first priority was to remain hidden and avoid confrontation. I moved quietly behind a large tree, crouching low, trying to make myself as small as possible. The figure paused several times, looking around, then continued moving in a way that suggested they were searching for something. I couldn't see any gear, no backpack, no tools. It was just a person walking through the forest, alone. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, someone hunting, a person with bad intentions. Every scenario felt worse than the last. I decided not to wait to see who they were. I retraced my steps along a side trail I had seen earlier, keeping my body low and using the natural cover of trees and bushes. I moved cautiously, every snap of a twig underfoot making me flinch. I kept checking over my shoulder, but the figure seemed to have disappeared from view. My only guide was memory and instinct as I navigated the uneven terrain, aiming for a spot I had marked in my mental map as a safer, more open area to set up camp. Hours passed before I finally reached the clearing. It was isolated, slightly elevated, with a stream nearby and enough flat ground for my tent. I quickly set up camp again, making sure to conceal it as much as possible behind natural cover. This time, I reinforced the perimeter, stacking rocks in places where someone might trip, arranging sticks around the edges, not as a defense but as a mental reassurance that I had control over my environment. I ate what I had left, drank water, and kept my flashlight and knife close at hand. Night fell again, darker than before, with clouds covering the moon. The forest noises were louder this time, sharper. Every rustle made my heart leap. I spent hours listening, imagining possible intruders, planning escape routes, calculating the time it would take to reach my car if I needed to leave. The night stretched endlessly. Somewhere in the distance, a howl, maybe a coyote, made me tense, but I reminded myself that I was better prepared this time. I had identified escape routes and had my pack ready. I could survive the night without panicking. Eventually, the sound of footsteps approached my camp again, soft but distinct. I held my breath, knife in hand, flashlight ready. They passed at the edge of the clearing, slow and deliberate, and then continued into the forest. I never saw who it was, never heard a word, but the tension in my body remained high. I stayed awake, listening until the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, pale and gentle, revealing a forest that looked entirely harmless in daylight. I decided that morning that I would leave. The forest was beautiful, but the presence of another person, moving silently and deliberately, was a risk I wasn't willing to take. I packed my gear carefully, extinguished the fire completely, and followed the faint trail back to my car. The hike took longer than expected, as I avoided the paths I suspected the person might have used. Each step was tense, every sound amplified. When I finally reached the car, relief flooded me. I loaded my gear, checked my surroundings, and started the engine. The forest behind me was silent once more, but I knew the memory of those nights would linger. The trip had been everything I had hoped for in terms of solitude and nature, but the encounter reminded me that being alone in a wilderness comes with unpredictable risks. I drove away slowly, eyes constantly scanning the edges of the road, until the forest was behind me, replaced by fields, then towns, and finally the hum of the highway. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted but safe. I unpacked my gear, checked my supplies, and finally allowed myself to relax. I had survived the wilderness, both the elements and the unknown presence in the forest. I would never forget the feeling of being truly alone, of having to rely entirely on my own instincts, and the stark reminder that nature is not only beautiful but also unpredictable. The trip had tested me in ways I had not anticipated, and I felt stronger, more aware, and strangely grateful for the experience. I debated following them, but my instincts told me not to. The idea of confronting another human in a remote forest, especially someone who might be dangerous, was frightening. I decided to head back to my camp, break everything down, and leave quietly. As I packed, I noticed something even more unsettling. The footprints were not alone. There were now two sets, following the same path, and they seemed to be moving closer to my clearing. My pulse quickened, and I realized I needed to leave as quickly and silently as possible. I gathered all my belongings and packed them into my backpack. I did my best to move quietly, avoiding stepping on dry leaves and twigs that could give away my presence. The forest, which had felt peaceful in the morning, now seemed alive with potential danger. I kept my eyes on the path, listening carefully, and moved faster than I had during any of my previous solo trips. As I approached the trailhead, I noticed a figure moving in the distance between the trees. I ducked behind a large oak and waited, my heart racing. The figure stopped, looking around, then continued walking slowly along the hidden path. I realized that whoever or whatever was following the trail had no idea I was leaving from the main trailhead, which gave me a small advantage. I quickened my pace and finally emerged onto the dirt road where I had parked my truck. I breathed a sigh of relief as I unlocked the vehicle and started the engine. The forest behind me seemed to settle back into normalcy, but I could not shake the unease. I drove slowly at first, glancing in the rearview mirror, making sure I was not being followed. Every rustle of leaves or movement in the shadows made me tense, but nothing appeared. Once I reached the main road, I felt some safety return. Cars passed by occasionally, and the sense of isolation faded. Driving back to town, I reflected on the night. I had been lucky. I had encountered someone or something that I had no idea about, someone willing to be in the forest at night, following hidden paths, and I had no way of knowing their intentions. It could have been a hiker, a hunter, or someone more dangerous. The randomness and unpredictability of it was terrifying. When I got home, I unpacked my gear carefully and made a mental note of the location of the clearing and the paths. I decided I would not return to that spot alone. It had been a harsh lesson in the risks of solo camping in remote areas. Safety precautions, awareness, and trusting instincts were not just abstract ideas. They could mean the difference between a peaceful trip and a dangerous situation. In the days following, I went through the mental process of replaying the events, trying to make sense of them. I realized I had been careful, but even careful plans could meet with unknown dangers. I also realized the importance of informing someone of your location when going into remote areas and having multiple ways to communicate, even if cell service is unreliable. Months later, I returned to the forest, but not to the same spot. I went with a friend, taking a well-known trail, setting up camp in a monitored area, and enjoying the quiet without the fear of being alone and exposed. The memory of that night stayed with me, though. The forest could be peaceful, but it could also harbor hidden dangers. Awareness, preparation, and caution were essential, and I carried that lesson with me in every solo trip afterward. That experience changed the way I approached wilderness adventures. I still loved camping, the smell of pine, the feel of soft soil beneath my hands, and the sound of water trickling over rocks. But I never underestimated the reality of being alone in a remote place. Nature is beautiful, but it is also indifferent to human presence. And sometimes the scariest moments are not caused by animals or weather, but by the unknown choices of other humans. From that day forward, every trip into the forest was a careful balance between appreciation and vigilance. I learned to respect the quiet, to pay attention to footprints, sounds, and shadows, and to trust my instincts. That night, though terrifying, had taught me a lesson I would never forget, and it ensured that I never again took solitude in the wilderness for granted. I had always loved camping alone. The idea of waking up to the smell of pine, of hearing birds start their day before the sun fully rose, gave me a sense of peace I could not find anywhere else. I had been camping alone several times before, usually for a weekend, sometimes for 3 or 4 days, and I had never had a problem. This time, however, I wanted to challenge myself. I chose a more remote spot, deep in a national forest that I had only seen on maps. It was far from the main trails, a place where few people ventured. I wanted solitude and the chance to be fully immersed in the woods. I arrived late in the morning, my truck loaded with a tent, sleeping bag, stove, plenty of food, water, and other supplies. The air smelled different as soon as I drove past the last dirt road that led to the main trailhead. It was crisp and earthy, with a faint dampness from overnight rain. I parked and began walking, carrying my pack, and immediately felt the isolation that I was seeking. The trail was overgrown in places, and branches brushed against my arms as I moved forward. Birds were calling in the distance, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush made me aware that I was not entirely alone. The sun was high by the time I found the small clearing I had seen on the map. It was perfect, a flat area with soft soil for my tent, surrounded by thick pine and oak trees, and a small stream a little way down the slope. I could hear the water trickling over rocks, and the sound added to the sense of seclusion. I started setting up my tent, making sure the ground was level and free of sharp rocks, and carefully arranging my supplies. I wanted to be prepared. Once my camp was set, I explored the surrounding area. There were animal tracks near the stream, probably deer, and I noticed broken branches and signs of smaller animals as well. The forest was quiet, too quiet in some ways, with only the occasional distant sound of a bird or a squirrel. By late afternoon, I had collected some firewood, enough to last the night, and had set up a small cooking area. I lit a small stove and prepared a simple meal of rice and canned beans. Eating alone in the middle of the forest felt strange at first, but also peaceful. As the sun started to descend, I sat near the edge of the clearing, watching the shadows lengthen. The forest took on a different character at this time. Shapes and shadows looked unfamiliar and sometimes menacing. I reminded myself that it was just the way light worked, the way my eyes adjusted, but the feeling lingered. Once the meal was done, I packed up the stove and set up a small fire. I sat close to it, the warmth reassuring as the temperature began to drop. Night came faster than I expected. The forest became darker, the sounds sharper, Owls hooted, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush made me sit up straighter. I had done plenty of solo camping, and I knew to stay calm and aware, but there was something about this particular spot that made me uneasy. I reminded myself to check the boundaries of my campsite and ensure everything was secure. Around 10 p.m., I went to the stream to fill a bottle with water. The moon was a thin crescent, providing little light, and I had to rely on my headlamp. The stream looked different at night, shadows stretching over the water and the rocks. When I bent down to fill my bottle, I noticed footprints in the mud along the bank. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but the shape and spacing were clearly human. They were fresh, leading along the stream, away from my campsite. My heart rate increased. I scanned the area with my headlamp, but saw nothing. Returning to my tent, I considered my options. I had brought a small folding knife, but I had no firearm. I could hear the sound of movement in the trees around the clearing, though it was distant. I tried to convince myself it was just a hiker, or perhaps a hunter, but something about the tracks, the timing, and the silence made me uneasy. I resolved to stay awake for a while, keeping the fire burning and listening. Hours passed slowly. Every crackle of the fire, every snap of a twig made me tense. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. I blinked, and it was gone, but the fear remained. I reminded myself that shadows could play tricks, but my instincts screamed that something was not right. I spent the rest of the night in a half-sleep state, the fire low but alive, constantly scanning the edges of the clearing. By dawn, I was exhausted. I had not slept well, maybe an hour or two at most. The forest looked more familiar in the morning light, and I thought about packing up and leaving, but I still wanted to explore the stream a little before going back. I moved carefully, my senses alert. That was when I noticed more signs, broken branches leading to a small, hidden path that ran parallel to the stream. The path was narrow, overgrown, and clearly not a main trail. The footprints continued along it. I had planned the trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping expedition in the mountains, away from cell service and the stress of work, a chance to reset my mind and feel the kind of silence that only the wild can give. I had been on short hiking trips before, but this would be my first time camping completely alone for more than 2 days. I told myself I was prepared, packed enough food, water, and gear to last a week, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a first aid kit, a small portable stove, extra batteries for my flashlight, and my backpack with all the essentials neatly arranged. I even studied the trail maps for hours, made note of water sources, and planned a loop that would keep me away from busy trails. The first day of the hike went exactly as planned. The sun was bright but soft through the canopy of the forest. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. I was excited, moving at a steady pace along the narrow trail, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of birds. The forest seemed alive but calm, welcoming me into its quiet world. I stopped for lunch near a small stream, the water cold and refreshing, and I took careful notes on landmarks. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing I had marked as my campsite for the first night. It was near a bend in the trail where the slope leveled off, with a patch of flat ground perfect for my tent and a natural windbreak of trees. I set up my tent carefully, staking it firmly into the ground, and collected some dry branches for a fire. As the sun dipped lower, the forest changed. Shadows stretched long between the trees, and the usual sounds of birds faded into distant rustlings that I couldn't immediately identify. I made a small fire and cooked a simple meal of dehydrated beans and rice. The firelight danced across the trees, giving the forest an almost unreal glow. I tried to shake off a small feeling of unease. This was supposed to be relaxing after all. But there was a subtle tension in the back of my mind. It wasn't fear exactly, just the awareness of being completely alone in the wilderness. Night fell quickly. The forest went from serene to something more uncertain. The wind picked up and carried strange, indistinct noises through the trees. A branch snapping here, a rustle of leaves there. I kept my flashlight close, shining it into the darkness around the campsite whenever I thought I heard movement. At one point, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light from the beam. I froze, heart thudding, but it was only a deer, tall and silent, staring before bounding away. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Wild animals were usually more afraid of humans than the other way around, but the adrenaline left a trace of tension in my chest. I went to sleep that first night with my knife and flashlight within reach, but I didn't get much rest. Every small noise woke me, and I spent hours staring at the tent walls, trying to convince myself I was safe. The forest is not quiet at night, and it is not kind. Even without danger, it can make you feel as though you are being watched. Every rustle and distant crack of wood magnified in your imagination. The next day, I woke early and packed up quickly. I wanted to reach a higher elevation I had planned, a ridge where the view of the surrounding mountains would be breathtaking. The morning was bright, and for a few hours, I walked with confidence, even whistling softly to myself. I crossed streams, clambered over rocks, and traced the trail markers carefully. It was physically demanding, but I felt a sense of accomplishment with every step. Around noon, I stopped for a small break, drinking water and eating some nuts. That was when I noticed something odd. Footprints. Not large animal tracks, but human footprints in the soft dirt near the stream. They were fresh, and there were not many, but they seemed to be coming from the direction I had just hiked from. I paused, considering what this meant. Another hiker? Possibly. A hunter? Also possible. The trail was mostly empty, so it made me uneasy, but I decided not to overthink it. I took a mental note to be cautious, kept my distance from the stream, and pressed on. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain became steeper. Rocks replaced soil, trees thinned out, and patches of snow appeared even though it wasn't deep winter. I had to scramble over boulders and use my hands for balance. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavier than the day before. I reached the ridge just as the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the jagged peaks. The view was extraordinary. Mountains rolling into the distance, valleys deep and shadowed, streams shining like silver threads. I stayed there for a while, taking pictures and drinking water, letting myself feel the reward of the climb. That evening, I found a small plateau that seemed suitable for my second night. I set up camp again, this time being extra careful to check for any signs of wildlife or other people. The air was thinner and colder at this elevation. I built a small fire and boiled water for my dinner. As night fell, the wind began to pick up. It whistled through the rocks and trees, sharp and chilling. I could hear distant howls, probably wolves, maybe coyotes. I wrapped myself tightly in my sleeping bag, trying to focus on my breathing and ignore the isolation. Around midnight, the noises in the forest escalated. A sudden snap of a branch made me sit up straight in my tent. Something heavy seemed to be moving around outside. I turned on my flashlight, sweeping it across the dark plateau. Shadows shifted in the rocky terrain, and for the first time I felt truly small and vulnerable. The movement was deliberate, not like an animal bounding away. It was slower, careful, and close enough to hear the crunch of gravel beneath boots. My heart pounded as I tried to assess the situation. I had no idea if it was another hiker, a hunter, or someone more dangerous. My first instinct was to stay quiet, not make a sound, and hope it passed. The figure or figures moved around my camp for nearly an hour. The fire, small as it was, provided a tiny shield of light, but shadows flickered beyond it. Every sound seemed amplified in the cold night air. I gripped my knife and flashlight tightly, debating whether to stay in the tent or make a run for it. The thought of running through the dark, uneven plateau was terrifying. My phone had no signal, so calling for help was impossible. The only thing I could do was wait, stay alert, and trust my instincts. Eventually, as dawn approached, the footsteps faded into the distance. My exhaustion overtook my fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep in the remaining warmth of my sleeping bag. When I woke, the plateau was empty. The wind had calmed, and the morning light made the rocky terrain seem almost harmless again. I inspected the area and found that someone had tampered with my campsite. My food bag was disturbed, though nothing was missing, and the perimeter of the plateau had faint footprints leading down the slope. Whoever had been there was gone, but the awareness that someone had been this close in the middle of the night stayed with me. I packed quickly and began my descent, keeping a sharper eye on my surroundings. I stayed on higher ground when possible, avoiding gullies or areas where someone could surprise me. The hike down was grueling, my legs and back aching from the climb and lack of sleep. When I finally reached a more traveled trail in the lower forest, I felt relief, though a lingering sense of unease remained. I met a few hikers along the trail who asked where I had camped, and I quickly gave vague answers, keeping my experience to myself. The forest felt less threatening now, more like a place I could observe safely from the beaten path. By the time I returned to my car at the trailhead, the sun was high and warm, and the forest behind me seemed almost benign. I loaded my gear, took a deep breath, and drove away. I had survived the ordeal without injury or confrontation, and in the daylight, the fear of the previous night seemed distant, though I knew it had been very real. The experience taught me more than any guidebook or checklist could. Nature is beautiful but indifferent, and being alone carries real risks. I learned the value of preparation, the importance of awareness, and the fact that sometimes the most frightening moments are not those you imagine, but those you cannot control, the sudden realization that someone else could be in your world while you are defenseless. I resolved to continue hiking, but with a new respect for solitude, for the unseen, and for the reality that even in the quietest forest, you are never truly alone. From that day on, every camping trip I planned included careful consideration of routes, elevation, water sources, escape paths, and the constant assumption that someone else could be nearby at any time. It changed the way I viewed the wilderness, not as a playground, but as a place that demanded attention, respect, and caution. And even though I returned safely, the memory of that night, of the faint, deliberate footsteps around my tent, remains vivid, a reminder of how fragile our sense of safety can be when we are truly alone. I had been planning this camping trip for months, mapping out a remote section of the national forest that I had never explored before. The idea was to get away from the noise of the city, from the constant hum of work, traffic, and screens, and spend a few days alone in the wild. I wasn't a novice camper. I had spent plenty of nights in tents and cabins, but something about this trip felt different, more isolated, more distant. I wanted solitude, but I hadn't anticipated how raw and unforgiving nature could feel when there was no one around. I left early in the morning, driving along narrow, winding roads that cut through dense clusters of pine and oak. The air smelled earthy and damp, a mix of soil and pine resin that filled the truck cabin with a sense of expectation. I had packed everything meticulously: a two-person tent, sleeping bag, extra clothing layers, stove, enough food and water for several days, a first aid kit, map, compass, flashlight, and a small hatchet. I had gone over the checklist several times, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything essential. I thought I was prepared for anything, but I would soon learn that nature could test you in ways no list could anticipate. The trailhead was quiet, almost unnervingly so. There were no other cars, no hikers, just a narrow dirt path disappearing into the thick forest. I parked my truck, took a deep breath, and hoisted my backpack. The weight was significant but manageable. I started walking, following the trail marked on my map. The path was uneven, strewn with loose rocks and fallen branches. I had to focus on every step, not wanting to twist an ankle far from help. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until the faint rustle of wind in the trees and the occasional bird call were the only sounds. I was alone. I had wanted this, but the solitude quickly became palpable, almost heavy. I set up camp in a small clearing about 2 miles in. The ground was level and dry, which was lucky, because further into the forest, the terrain was uneven and muddy from recent rains. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the rain flap was secure and the stakes were buried deep. I gathered firewood from nearby fallen branches, taking care not to use anything still alive. The fire was crucial. It was warmth, safety, and a psychological shield against the darkness that would fall. I arranged the wood meticulously and lit a small fire with matches, the flames crackling and hissing as they consumed dry pine needles. As night began to fall, the forest transformed. Shadows lengthened and merged, creating a dense, suffocating darkness beyond the radius of my firelight. Every sound became amplified. The snap of a twig under a small animal's foot, the rustle of leaves as the wind shifted, the distant croak of frogs near a stream I could barely see. I could feel the air cool rapidly, and the fire was my only comfort. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and rice, washing it down with water I had carried in a filtered bottle. I tried to relax, convincing myself that the isolation was peaceful, but a lingering sense of unease stayed with me. It was the kind of unease that creeps under your skin, subtle but persistent. Around 10 p.m., I decided to extinguish the fire and get into my sleeping bag. I left a small ember burning, hoping it would last in case I needed warmth or light later. The darkness enveloped me, and the sounds of the forest intensified. At first, it was just the regular night noises, but gradually, I started noticing subtle movements and sounds that didn't seem entirely natural. Branches scraping against each other in a pattern, almost like deliberate movements. A soft crunching of leaves that sounded like it was coming closer and then farther away. My mind tried to rationalize it. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox, but instinctively I felt watched. There was something different about these noises, an intensity that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I stared at the tent walls, imagining shadows moving just beyond the fabric. Sleep was impossible. I listened intently, straining to make sense of every sound. At some point, I heard a low, deep growl, not from a dog or a wolf, but something larger, something human-sized. My heart jumped, and I froze. The growl repeated, softer this time, almost deliberate. I realized that whatever it was circling my campsite. My instincts screamed at me to grab my backpack and leave immediately, but I didn't want to run blindly into the darkness. I slowly reached for my flashlight, keeping my movements minimal, and turned it on. The beam cut across the forest, illuminating the nearest trees, but I saw nothing. The growl had stopped. Silence. My body trembled, not from the cold, but from fear and adrenaline. I didn't know if it was a wild animal, another human, or just my imagination, but the feeling of being stalked was unmistakable. I decided not to sleep that night. I kept the fire going as long as possible, adding wood carefully and silently, so as not to reveal my exact location if someone, or something, was indeed nearby. I stayed inside the tent, peering out cautiously. Hours passed, and the forest remained unervingly still. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I fell into a shallow, fitful sleep, waking several times to check my surroundings. Morning brought a false sense of relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the forest in warm golden hues. I convinced myself that the night had been a combination of imagination and natural forest sounds. I ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal and fruit, packed up, and began hiking further into the forest. The map indicated a small stream a mile ahead where I planned to refill my water. The forest was dense, and the trail less distinct. Fallen branches and overgrown shrubs made navigation challenging, and I constantly checked my compass to ensure I wasn't veering off course. The sounds of the day were more familiar, birds, insects, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel, but I remained hyper-aware, glancing over my shoulder frequently. When I reached the stream, the relief of finding running water was quickly overshadowed by a discovery that made my heart stop. I noticed footprints in the mud along the bank. Large, deep, and not matching any animal I knew. They were human. My stomach turned. The footprints were fresh, and they followed the same path as mine, almost as if someone had been tracking me through the forest. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I filled my water bottle quickly, scanning the forest for movement. There was none, but the footprints were proof. I wasn't alone. I decided to move faster, taking care to make no sudden noise. Every step felt heavy with tension, and my senses sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. The forest no longer felt like a place of peace. It was oppressive, threatening, a maze with no clear exit. Hours passed. I tried to focus on hiking efficiently, following the trail that I hoped would lead to a secondary exit point marked on my map. I avoided high grasses and thick bushes where someone could hide. I listened intently, catching faint rustles in the underbrush that made me freeze repeatedly. My mind ran through worst-case scenarios, considering who could be following me and why. Could be a hunter, an escaped criminal, or someone else entirely. The uncertainty gnawed at me. I didn't want to confront whoever or whatever it was. My only goal was to reach safety. I realized that relying on daylight was critical. Once night fell again, I would be trapped in the same terrifying darkness as before. By late afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. I had been hiking for hours, stopping only briefly to rest and hydrate. My legs were sore, my feet bruised from uneven terrain. I considered setting up a temporary camp, but I knew that stopping would make me vulnerable. The forest was too dense to move quickly after dark, and the thought of being followed made me paranoid. I kept moving, forcing myself to focus on the trail, on every landmark that would confirm my location. I checked the map repeatedly, estimating the distance to the nearest road that might lead me out. The forest seemed endless, each bend and cluster of trees appearing identical to the last. Time stretched on, and the sun sank lower, casting long shadows that played tricks on my eyes. As the light waned, I reached a small clearing and relief surged. There was a narrow dirt road cutting through the forest. It wasn't the main highway, but it was enough to know I could follow it toward civilization. I approached cautiously, scanning the edges of the forest for movement. Nothing appeared, and I allowed myself a small, cautious sense of hope. My pace quickened as I stepped onto the road, listening for any sign of pursuit. I walked briskly for hours, following the winding path, until faint signs of human presence appeared. Discarded cans, tire tracks, and eventually, a fence marking the edge of private property. Finally, I reached a main road. I saw a truck parked a short distance ahead, and a figure moving around it. My legs felt like they were going to collapse, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I waved frantically, and the person noticed me, approaching quickly. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong it brought tears to my eyes. I explained that I had been hiking alone and had become disoriented in the forest. The driver gave me water, food, and a place to rest while contacting authorities. I recounted the experience in detail, describing the footprints, the growls, and the constant feeling of being followed. Officers later searched the forest, finding nothing, but they took the evidence I had collected and promised to increase patrols in the area. The sense of threat remained, but at least I was safe. In the days that followed, I reflected on the experience. I realized that preparation could only go so far. The forest was alive and unpredictable, capable of testing your mind and body in ways no amount of gear or experience could fully mitigate. Fear was as much a part of the experience as the beauty of the wilderness. I also learned the value of caution, observation, and maintaining awareness at all times. What could have been a simple camping trip had become an intense struggle for survival. Yet I survived. I returned home physically unharmed and more aware of my limits and strengths. The forest had challenged me, and I had emerged from it with a clear understanding of both danger and resilience. The memory remained vivid, and while the fear lingered, it was tempered by the clarity of having faced it and having walked out alive. The forest was a place of beauty, but also one that demanded respect, patience, and vigilance. I would never forget the lessons I learned there, nor the sheer intensity of being truly alone and truly aware of the wild around me. I remember that trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened months ago. I had been planning it for weeks, carefully picking a remote camping spot far from any trailheads or other hikers. I wanted isolation, the kind of solitude where the only sound is the wind through the trees or the occasional snap of a branch under a deer's weight. I packed my gear meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and a small folding stove. I wanted to be prepared for anything, yet I knew that being alone in the wilderness meant I was responsible for myself entirely. No one else could rescue me if I made a mistake. I drove for hours, leaving the pavement behind, following a gravel road that narrowed and became rougher with every mile. The map showed a small trail leading into dense forest. I parked my car at the edge where the trail began. The air smelled like damp earth, pine, and something else I couldn't identify at first. A metallic tang, faint, almost imperceptible. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the soil or a nearby creek. The hike in wasn't easy. The trail twisted and turned, and the forest thickened around me. Sunlight barely reached the ground. I noticed a few animal tracks. Deer, perhaps a raccoon, but nothing larger. I felt comfortable at first, enjoying the quiet, the feeling of being completely alone, untethered from the noise of civilization. I stopped every so often to drink water, eat a snack, or simply take in the towering trees. I noticed the forest floor was uneven, with thick roots and moss-covered rocks that made footing tricky. My pack was heavy, but I was used to carrying weight, and the sense of anticipation kept me going. After several hours, I came upon a clearing by a small stream. It was perfect, flat ground, a little distance from the water, enough natural shelter from the wind thanks to the surrounding trees. I set up my tent carefully, staking it firmly into the ground, and gathered wood for a fire. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest seem even more alive. I had the sense that even the smallest noises were amplified: the rustle of leaves, the scurry of squirrels, the distant caw of a crow. That first night, I cooked a simple meal over my small stove. I tried to enjoy the stillness, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't shake. Something about being completely alone in such a vast forest made me hyper-aware of every sound. When I lay down in my sleeping bag, I could hear the creek burbling softly, the occasional snap of a branch, and the whisper of wind through the trees. At first, I found it soothing, but as hours passed, the noises became harder to ignore. Every crack sounded like footsteps. Every rustle made my heart jump. I woke several times during the night, convinced I heard something approaching my tent. I would lie perfectly still, straining to listen. Eventually, the sounds faded, or perhaps I convinced myself they had. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved. The second day was meant to be relaxed. I planned to explore the area, maybe follow the creek upstream to see if there were any natural pools or waterfalls. The hike was easy at first, but the forest grew thicker. I had to push through low branches, hop over fallen trees, and skirt around patches of wet ground. The deeper I went, the more I noticed signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, claw marks on tree trunks. Nothing alarming, but it was a reminder that I was in someone else's territory. Around midday, I stumbled across an abandoned campsite. There was a tattered tarp tied between two trees, a few burned logs, and a rusted stove that looked decades old. Oddly, there were food wrappers that seemed more recent, not decades old. I checked the area carefully. No one was around, and I couldn't hear anything except the forest sounds. It gave me an uneasy feeling, a sense of someone having been there recently and leaving suddenly. I noted it in my mind but continued upstream. As I went deeper, the creek narrowed, and the forest became denser. The sunlight barely reached the ground now, and the temperature dropped slightly. I kept my pace steady, but I began to notice a subtle change in the sounds around me. The usual bird calls were absent. Even the wind through the trees sounded muffled, as if something heavy had settled over the forest. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the natural rhythm of the forest. It was late afternoon when I realized I had lost track of time. I turned back toward the clearing where my tent was, but the path I had followed wasn't as obvious as I remembered. Trees looked similar, and the underbrush had changed subtly. I tried to retrace my steps, but it felt like I was walking in circles. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't far from my tent in terms of distance, but in this thick forest, the landmarks I had relied on were gone. By the time I realized I was truly lost, the sun had dipped low, and shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees. I knew I needed to find my way back before darkness fully set in. My flashlight was in my pack, but I hated the idea of using it unless absolutely necessary. I tried to remain calm, retracing my steps as methodically as I could. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my stomach tighten. Night fell faster than I expected. I eventually gave in and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing thick underbrush and twisted roots. I could barely make out the path I had taken earlier. I stopped frequently to listen, trying to orient myself, but every direction looked the same. Panic was rising. My chest tightened, my breathing became shallow, and I realized how dangerous it could be to wander lost in a forest at night. I had limited water, some snacks, and my pack was heavy, but more than anything, I was alone. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself of survival basics. Stay put if you're lost, conserve energy, keep warm, and signal for help if necessary. I looked around for a place to make a temporary camp. I found a small clearing with a few logs that could serve as a windbreak. I set up my tent again as best I could in the dim light, built a small fire, and ate some snacks to keep my energy up. The firelight gave me comfort. The flames flickered against the trees, casting long shadows, but at least I wasn't completely swallowed by darkness. The night was long. Every sound made me tense. I heard movement outside the tent, twigs snapping under what could only have been an animal. I considered leaving the tent to investigate, but reminded myself of the dangers. Bears, mountain lions, or even just falling in the dark. I stayed inside, listening, heart racing, until exhaustion finally overcame me. Morning brought a sense of relief. I could see the faint outlines of familiar trees and, in the distance, my stream. I packed my tent carefully, leaving no trace, and followed the stream downstream. Eventually, I recognized the clearing where I had first set up camp. Relief washed over me in a way I can barely describe. I had survived the night, alone, without any help, but the experience left me shaken. I realized that the forest wasn't inherently frightening, but being unprepared, alone, and lost made it terrifying. The rest of the day was cautious. I moved slowly, carefully marking trees and noting landmarks so I wouldn't get lost again. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed against it, exhausted, and took a long moment to breathe. The safety of civilization felt profound. That day, I drove home in silence, thinking about how fragile a person can feel when alone in nature. The experience taught me a lot about preparation, respect for the wilderness, and the importance of not underestimating the simple dangers of isolation. In the weeks afterward, I thought about that trip constantly. I realized that fear isn't always about monsters or myths. Sometimes it's about being truly alone, facing uncertainty, and recognizing that one small mistake can become life-threatening. I became meticulous about planning every hike after that. I never took shortcuts or underestimated distances. I invested in navigation tools, carried extra supplies, and always told someone exactly where I was going. That camping trip stayed with me because it wasn't about horror in the supernatural sense. It was about the raw, stark reality of being alone in the wilderness, where every sound and every shadow can feel dangerous, and where your survival depends entirely on your preparation, your wits, and your endurance. The forest is beautiful and serene, but it is also indifferent. It doesn't care about you, your plans, or your fears. It was a lesson I learned firsthand, a lesson I will never forget, and one that changed the way I approach the outdoors forever. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I was drawn to the idea of escaping the city for a few days, carrying nothing but my backpack, a tent, and the basic gear I thought I'd need. I wasn't seeking adventure in the extreme sense. I just wanted quiet, solitude, and a sense of being immersed in the forest. The place I chose was a national forest known for its dense woods, rocky terrain, and rivers that glistened under the sunlight. It wasn't remote in the sense that it was unreachable, but it was far enough from any road or trail that you felt entirely removed from the human world. I left early in the morning. The drive itself was quiet, the kind of road that wound through old pine trees and mossy cliffs, where the sun filtered through the branches and through scattered patterns on the asphalt. I reached the trailhead around 10 in the morning. I parked my car, double-checked my backpack, and took my first steps onto the dirt trail. It was narrower than I expected, flanked on either side by tall ferns and thick undergrowth. the smell of damp earth heavy in the air. The forest was alive with small noises, birds calling, the rustle of squirrels, the occasional drip of water from leaves, but it was calm, almost soothing. The hike to the camping spot I had marked on the map took longer than I expected. The trail was uneven, rocky, and sometimes disappeared under fallen leaves. I passed a few small streams, crossing them carefully, balancing on slick stones, feeling the chill of the water near my boots. The terrain gradually rose, leading to a plateau that gave a sweeping view of the valley below. The forest here was older, the trees taller and denser, their trunks thick and gnarled. The sunlight barely reached the ground, leaving patches of shadow that seemed to stretch and move with the breeze. I reached the clearing I had planned to camp in just before late afternoon. It was larger than I anticipated, flat and free of debris, surrounded by towering pines. A small creek ran nearby, the sound of its movement blending into the hum of the forest. I set up my tent meticulously, staking it firmly and making sure the rainfly was secure. I organized my gear, laid out my sleeping bag, and arranged my small cooking supplies. The sun was beginning its descent, turning the sky into shades of orange and purple. The air cooled quickly, and I felt the first real bite of isolation. As night fell, the forest transformed. The sounds I had heard during the day changed, becoming sharper, closer, and more unpredictable. I heard twigs snap somewhere in the distance, leaves rustling against unseen movement. I kept telling myself it was animals, the normal wildlife of the forest, but the feeling of being watched settled in anyway. I built a small fire, watching it crackle and flare in the darkness, and tried to calm my mind. I ate a simple meal, canned beans, some bread, a small amount of jerky, and then cleaned up quickly, putting all my food in a bear-proof container away from the tent. The first unsettling moment came just after the fire had started to die down. I was sitting in my folding chair, the smoke curling upward, when I noticed a figure at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a tree, or perhaps a shadow, but it moved slightly, a subtle shift that made my stomach tighten. It was still far enough that I couldn't make out details, but it was humanoid in shape. I froze. My first thought was someone else was hiking or camping nearby, which was possible but unlikely this deep in the woods. I held my breath, watching it, and then, as if it realized I was watching, it ducked behind a tree and disappeared. My heart was racing, but I told myself I was imagining it, that the shadows of the forest played tricks at night. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound made me tense. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the occasional scurrying of small animals. Around midnight, I heard a low, deliberate sound, like a footstep, heavy, pressing against the forest floor near my tent. I froze, my body rigid. The sound stopped, and then, after a few moments, I heard it again, slightly closer. I hadn't made any noise. My mind raced. It had to be someone or something approaching. The rational part of me wanted to leave the tent, but I also knew that stepping out into the darkness was dangerous without a weapon or clear knowledge of what I was facing. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only trees and undergrowth. I could see nothing. Then I heard it, a clear, deliberate rustle, and a faint snapping of a branch. Someone or something was moving around the perimeter of my campsite. I could see the faint outline of a shape shifting behind the trees, always staying just out of the light. I checked my phone for signal, none. No way to call for help. My heart pounded, every muscle tense. I realized that retreating into the tent wasn't safe either. If it was a person with bad intentions, hiding meant I was trapped. I thought about the options: run, hide, or confront. I had a small knife, but it wasn't enough to feel secure. I decided to stay put, hoping the figure would leave. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and held it like a club, shining it toward every shadow, waiting.